is this House would give dictators immunity in exchange for their resignation. I call upon the Prime Minister to begin this debate.
Okay, just testing again before I start. Okay. Right, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. From side government, what have we got for you today? This House would grant immunity. This House would give dictators immunity in exchange for their resignation. We're trying to solve a problem from government side of the House. What is that problem that we present you today? We present the problem of a lack of political change in Zimbabwe. We're looking at Zimbabwe. How are we going to define dictators? What we're going to define dictators as in this particular case is Robert Mugabe and all those people who prop up the ZANU-PF regime. So we're talking about the army generals that are crucial to the ZANU-PF regime. We're also going to talk about the police and members of the police service as well that have helped intelligence agencies and those sorts of things. And we're also looking at the top cronies in the political party of the ZANU-PF regime. We're looking at those as the dictators in Zimbabwe. We're looking at those Mugabe and the people who directly have helped him incorporate the ZANU-PF regime in this particular case. What we're saying on our side of the House is by granting them immunity for their resignation, that's going to help the unity process in Zimbabwe and help the movement for democratic change to get power in Zimbabwe. Okay, so that's essentially what we're saying. We're saying, first of all, there's a problem in Zimbabwe. There's a lack of political change in Zimbabwe. Okay, we've seen in recent elections people voting more for Lusanda than for ZANU-PF. We've seen that there's an overwhelming groundswell support for the MDC, but there's a problem that at the top level that's not changing. And what we're arguing from our side of the House is the reason that's not changing is because of the fact that ZANU-PF, Mugabe and his top officials fear persecution if they let go of power. If we remove that hurdle, and if we remove the fact that they fear persecution, and we say you won't be prosecuted for those powers, they're going to give up power, and it's going to lead to democracy in Zimbabwe and to real democracy and real governance in Zimbabwe. Okay. So what is our burden of proof here from proposition? Okay. And what we're going to argue from our side of the House is first of all that this will be effective. Okay. This is going to be effective in helping the unity government in Zimbabwe. This will be effective in, for example, dealing with the issue of the control of the police and the army and how that will move across the NDC. This will be effective in who controls the Reserve Bank and getting rid of Gideon Bono as a Reserve Bank governor. We're going to say that ZANU-PF are going to get rid of that particular power. Okay, they're going to say, look, we'll be hands off for those particular things. That's firstly our first burden of proof that it's going to be effective. Okay, and in being effective, it's beneficial for the people of Zimbabwe. Okay, that's beneficial for the people of Zimbabwe that the NDC get political power. Okay, more than that, just being effective, we're saying that it's justified in terms of the principles of justice. We're going to say on our side of the House, and the big point that we need to prove to you today, that it's actually okay. Piece of time, I won't take you. It's actually okay to grant these people immunity in the sense of restorative justice. And we're going to be analysing the victims that have been harmed in the past in this particular debate, and we're going to be saying how this serves their needs for justice best in this particular debate. So we can show you those two things, that in terms of effectiveness, from our side of the House, that by granting them immunity is going to lead to good political change in Zimbabwe, and secondly, that in terms of the principles of justice, this is a justified thing. We think that inside government, we can all win this case today. Okay, yeah, I'll take it.
Okay, supposing that Mugabe is holding on to power purely for the sake of power, not because he fears persecution, how are you going to do that, sir?
We're going to argue, and that leads me greatly into my first point. Why is ZANU-PF holding on to power for fear of persecution? Okay, now let me give you, please sit down. Let me give you background to ZANU-PF and Zimbabwe for those of you that don't know the history of Zimbabwe. Let's have a look at the things that people want to prosecute ZANU-PF for. The first thing is the Guguruvindi, which happened in the 1980s, when there was opposition to Mugabe at the time by Joshua Nkomo and his supporters within ZAPU, which was a political wing that supported them. What happened to them? As soon as they voted against Mugabe, they were crushed. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that there was a genocide that took place in the 80s. People are champing at the bit to hold Mugabe to account, but also the generals that orchestrated that. Okay, that's the first count. The second count is Operation Murambatsvina. There were a lot of human rights abuses, piece of time, that took place when people were forcibly evicted from their houses. That happened in the late 90s or early 2000s. We look at the farm invasions and we look at the farm invasions and the human rights abuses that took place there. People are waiting to persecute for those things. Okay, and then lastly, people are looking to persecute just for the general dictatorship and the general beating up of the NDC officials that we've been seeing and the general violence against the opposition. So it's all these sorts of things that human rights organizations and international organizations are waiting in the wings to prosecute ZANU-PF about. Okay, but we're going to contend on our side of the house that it's not just Mugabe that orchestrated these sorts of things. It was the army generals as well, and it was top political officials, and those sorts of things. So we argue on our side of the house is, and this is what happened in Zimbabwe after the March elections of 2008, when Morgan Tsvangirai got more votes in ZANU-PF. There was a 5-hour meeting of the ZANU-PF heads, and in that 5-hour meeting, what happened was Mugabe was forced and pressurized to stay in power by his army generals. Why was that the case, ladies and gentlemen? At that point, Robert Mugabe was quite happy to hand over power. Why did that happen? Because as soon as Mugabe steps out of power, those army generals are then in the firing range. Those army generals are the ones that are then going to answer to things. They're going to answer to Operation Ramatsvina. They're going to answer to the Guguruhuni. And it's for those reasons that the army generals, we're talking about Mujuru and the boys here, for those of you who know from Zimbabwe. Okay, we're talking about those types of army generals that had massive political pressure and political sway within the ZANU-PF parties, were the ones that said to Mugabe, stay on, fight for power, because without you in place, our asses are in the firing line. Shoot.
All right. Going after the state army generals, and we're going after this top henchmen. What about the guys on the ground that carried out these actual deeds?
What we're saying in terms of political immunity, in terms of immunity for these things, is that we're not going to look under rocks to try and find where these people persecuted these crimes. We're going to overlook it, and people who took part in these things are going to get immunity. That's the burden we set on our side of the house. We're not going to go into a witch hunt and try and find out who the actual perpetrators of these things were, okay, on the ground and those sorts of things. We're just going to give them immunity. We're not going to prosecute. Okay, and as I've shown you from my analysis now, that by not prosecuting, we're going to see them ceasing power. We're going to see them let go of power because of the fact that their primary concern for holding on to power will then be dealt with. Their concern for holding on to power is the idea that they fear prosecution. When we take that fear away, we take away their reason for holding on to power, and that's essentially the effectiveness on our side of the house. That as soon as you grant this immunity, you're going to see ZANU-PF hand over the police force and their army to NDC. They're going to hand over the position of Reserve Bank Governor, because the Reserve Bank Governor is the way in which they've developed funds to keep the army and police on their side, those sorts of things. So that's why we're going to be seeing it. Okay, I'm going to hit on this point of analysis of justice, and why, in principle, this is a good thing for justice, and why this is okay. Okay. What we're going to say on our side of the house is that justice is about restoring a balance. And what we're going to say on our side of the house, that balance is restored as soon as you give Zimbabweans dignity, the political dignity of having a democratically elected government, taking care of their needs. You're going to be restoring their political freedoms and those sorts of things in Zimbabwe. And what we're going to say on our side of the house, that the person on the ground, firstly, is going to benefit from this, because they're going to have the democratically elected NDC in power that have their real needs at heart. And the second thing why they're going to benefit from this is because we see on our side of the house that their general standards of living and their general conditions are going to improve. And what we see on our side of the house is that's the restoration that people need to see in Zimbabwe. The people that have been disenfranchised for decades, that's essentially the justice that needs to happen, that they need to restore their political rights, and they need to get the democratically elected government to preside over them. For those reasons, I beg to abstain.
Yeah, look at
The House thanks Clive for his speech and calls upon the leader of the opposition, Moses.
Alright, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. But we have primarily come from the side from proposition here this evening. It's very simple. But they advocated this whole idea of restorative justice, which, as they point out, would then lead to incentivizing somehow Robert Mugabe and his cohorts to step off government. Okay, that's what we're getting from that. Restorative justice is the best way to go about getting rid of Robert Mugabe. We will contend, however, ladies and gentlemen, that restorative justice in the African context will not be good enough to solve the problem here. And what restorative justice will not work. And what we will contend for is corrective justice in this instance. How are we going to go about corrective justice in this Minnesota? Pointing out a few things that are currently wrong, particularly in Zimbabwe and in the rest of the continent as well. But since we've talked about Zimbabwe now, let's put the whole issue of lack of governmental accountability, that what they're talking about will promote, ladies and gentlemen. And the fact that this is generally a trade-off between human rights and human rights violation and immunity for perpetuating these wrongs, okay? Dictatorial immunity in that sense. And we want to contend that this whole total immunity thing that they just put before us as as a result of this restorative justice that they push for is totally incorrect, and we want to contend against it. Now, let's begin firstly with this whole example of Mugabe wanting to step down in the 5-hour meeting that Bob had. Unfortunately, some of us do not have access to that meeting, so we don't know what exactly we're talking about. But this 5-hour meeting that Bob Mugabe had with the rest of his cohorts, okay? What they say to us is that in that 5-hour meeting, Robert Mugabe wanted to step down, but it was the military leaders that believed that the political sway with him that did not want him to step down. That points to the fact that Mugabe himself, as a leader of state, does not fear a sense of persecution, okay? And we'd like to contend that because he doesn't fear a sense of persecution, we shouldn't then give him total immunity because there's no fear that comes across from his side, okay? The other thing that, and we raise this in the POI, what we raise in the POI is the simple fact that, listen, if you're going after the state pension, if you're going after the army generals, what about the people that on the ground that carried out these actual orders? Because these are the people that will be coming across, the very people that they would have persecuted crimes against every day, okay? A pointed example here is South Africa, and I'm going to be looking at South Africa's past as an analysis to show you guys why this type of restorative justice did not necessarily work in South Africa particularly, okay, where we had a previous racial and dictatorial regime. Alright, now let's look at this whole issue of lack of governmental accountability. We haven't seen any accountability whatsoever in Zimbabwe so far, as per what they have told us this evening. And we would like to contend that this solution of unconditional immunity that they will provide Robert Mugabe would not in any case lead to the next regime also being accountable, ladies and gentlemen, to what will be happening. Now, let's provide an example to what they pointed out. What happened in South Africa when apartheid was dealt with was this whole notion of total immunity granted to apartheid Asians, okay? What happened in that sense is that these guys received total immunity for the crimes that they committed. Fortunately, in that case, these guys had to account for these crimes, okay? In this instance, what we get from these guys that there will be no accountability whatsoever for the crimes that those guys committed. But what happened is that they accounted for those crimes that they committed. And after accounting for those crimes, ladies and gentlemen, they got on scot-free. Nothing was happened. Those guys there was no form of punitive justice that took place. 15 years down the line or 10 years down the line, you saw a scenario in South Africa where people walked around mentally scarred, the psychological effect that this had on the general populace that had to suffer from the people that carried out from the people that carried out these gruesome acts against them, okay? That's essentially what you saw happening. And this is something content we will see happening in Zimbabwe as well, because that is what these guys are advocating for, okay? We will see total immunity leading to a situation, ladies and gentlemen, where Robert Mugabe would step down, and his henchmen would also step down because they'll be protected. But the actual people that carried out these gruesome acts on their behalf would not be protected from any form of backlash from the population in general. Please be quick, sir.
What you've asserted is that in South Africa the model is bad. Then show us why a model in South Africa of corrective justice would have been better.
Alright, so answer. I think the point you can see is that we still have not had a situation where, for instance, the family of Steve Biko has laid rest their son, purely because the people that murdered Biko have not accounted for their murders and have not accepted the fact that they murdered Biko, okay? So those people still walk around with the mental scars because they see them every day and say, those are the guys that murdered my father, but they did not come out and say, we have murdered this individual. Sit down, sir. Alright, so now, the point that we'd like to move on and we'd like to contend with is that we all agree there's a need to get rid of dictators again, there's a need to get rid of Robert Mugabe. That's what we'd like to get to. But we're saying that unconditional immunity is not the way to go about it. We're saying that Robert Mugabe should be incentivized in this fashion to get out of his dictatorial regime, okay? And as has been told to us by proposition, that the guy is actually willing to get out, so long as we provide some form of protection for him, okay? What we're saying is that Robert Mugabe can then be given access to go to any country of exile of choice that he wants to go to, and that is willing to take him in. And we feel that if he incentivizes that way, and you guarantee him some form of the similar kind of state leading that he's currently getting, and this will result from, naturally, every former head of state gets, sit down, every former head of state gets some form of grant, okay, that this guy can get for the rest of their lives. And we contend basically that because this would have been a negotiated process from his own government, it is his own government that has to pay for this for his living in a different country for the rest of his life, where he will be required to do whatever nominal involvement that he would like to get into, okay? We're saying that conditional immunity, where you have had this person go through some form of a tribunal, where he would have accounted for his crimes, and where every single person that would have committed gruesome crimes especially would have accounted for the crimes that they committed, is the way to go. This assists generally with corrective justice because it restores the position of the people that have suffered at the hands of the perpetrators in the past, and it also gives a sense that restorative justice has taken place, because the only way the people of Africa, particularly the people of Zimbabwe, would feel that restoration has taken place is if the people that have perpetrated the crimes that they've done account for them, ladies and gentlemen. And we're saying in this instance that the head of state, who's the actual dictator in this instance, would then have to account to some form of tribunal. But in that instance, would have to have access to an exile country that is willing to take him in, to ensure his protection, okay? But at the same time, the people that will come to answer. And people that have committed this gruesome act will have to account for them, and we'll have to ensure that they're dealt with. We believe that this is incentive enough for him to step down, because all we want to see is regime change. All we'd like to see in a country like Zimbabwe is a change of power. It's proper elections that will be taking place where there will be proper governmental accountability. Finalists will come and speak about the whole notion of value for good governance. Okay, why human rights? Why setting of having a setup between violent human rights abuse and dictatorial immunity is not the correct way to go about this thing. He'll also speak to the whole issue of the bad precedents that we're setting off, especially for African countries where we've seen that dictatorial leadership is much more prone, particularly for Zimbabwe, because this might just create a scenario where if the MBC comes into power, they do exactly what Bob has just done now, that the guys that they will come up with here, ladies and gentlemen. We believe that we've sufficiently proven to you that restorative justice in the manner that they have proposed it is not the way to go, and we will contend for corrective justice, which will eventually in the long run, ladies and gentlemen, lead to restorative justice, especially for the psychological effects that you will have on the former victims or the former victims that the crimes people will be perpetrated. For the reasons we've put up above, we choose to contend this motion.
Calls upon the Deputy Prime Minister, Ingrid.
Alright, testing. Okay, this is working. Good evening, everyone. Okay, what I'm going to be doing for you this evening is essentially first giving you a few points of rebuttal that we've heard from the leader of the opposition here this evening, and then I'm going to be extending the case that Clive brought up, dealing a bit further with this point of efficacy, and then I'm going to be giving you an analysis of the purposes of prosecution and how those purposes essentially are not met by allowing the prosecution of these people we've defined the motion to today. Okay, essentially, to deal with my rebuttal. The essential clash that's come up here today is that government is proposing a restorative model of justice and the side is proposing a corrective and retributive model of justice. I'd like to point out at this point that at no point did they clash on our issue of efficacy, so we can assume that that stands on the side of the debate from opening government, okay? They haven't clashed with this idea that it is going to incentivize people settling down at any point, so there's no point for me to carry on with that. Okay, I've got essentially let's call them three major points of rebuttal. Okay, this first one, the leader of the opposition came up here and talked about Clive's example of the 5-hour meeting where Bob Mugabe was quite keen to step down, okay, but wasn't allowed to by his military generals. Okay, now they try to swing this to say that, you know what, that shows that Mugabe in fact doesn't fear prosecution. Ladies and gentlemen, they're missing the essential point here. What that example shows is in fact that Mugabe was wanting to step down at that point because then all the blame would go from him to the army generals for the perpetuation of the dictatorship, so that there would be more blame in future taken away from him and put on others. The exact reason he wanted to sit down and he said you had your chance was essentially to get rid of this idea of his own accountability. So that point falls. Okay. essentially what they came up here and talked about today was this idea of accountability, okay? And they firstly talked about how we should have ZANU-PF being accountable, and they secondly talked about this idea of the MDC should be accountable and how we're setting a negative precedent. Okay, first dealing with this idea of ZANU-PF accountability. They came up and told us that, you know what, people only feel that justice has been done once someone's prosecuted and put behind bars. Ladies and gentlemen, we say that that is simply not true. Okay, our argument on our side of the house is that the people in Zimbabwe on the ground would far rather that conditions change tomorrow, that their rights are met, that they have a free place to live in, that they have rights, and that they, if I say rights once more, but that their rights are met and the rest of it, than the idea that maybe somebody will be prosecuted in 15 years' time. Okay, we're saying that our policy incentivizes drastic change that needs to happen in Zimbabwe, will incentivize that quick change, and will really do things for people on the ground. And we're saying that justice is about restoring this balance to these people, okay? So people would far rather, in fact, have everything guaranteed to them, have their rights guaranteed, then think, well, maybe in the future, in about 20 years' time, when eventually they get out of power, maybe somebody might be prosecuted. Okay, so that deals with the point of ZANU-PF accountability. They try to bring up the South African example, ladies and gentlemen, and in fact that works in our favour. If you look at the example of the TRC, the reason people were given immunity at that stage was because of the political climate. Unless that had been promised, there would have been no step down. Those leaders would have come onto power for a much, much longer time, okay? And that's exactly what we think should happen in Zimbabwe. No, thank you, sir. We think that, no, thank you. We think that on our side of the house, what we need to do is change the look at the political climate and realize that no one's going to step down unless we incentivize in some way. Okay, finally, let me deal with their counter policy that came up halfway through. They said, you know what, we should just give Mugabe political asylum. Can I point out the essential contradiction in opening opposition's case? They say to us firstly that justice requires that people need to be punished and the rest of it, and then say, let's get Mugabe off strike free. Ladies and gentlemen, that's an absolute contradiction in their case. Okay. We have a problem with the idea that they're just getting Mugabe off, because there is a whole network of people who are dependent on him for their power, and we think those people need to be dealt with as well. That's why our policy is dealing with all of his cronies as well. Okay, so that essentially deals with my rebuttal of their case, okay? And that's why this stage, essentially, Clive in my case, stands pretty much intact from opening government. Alright, so what am I going to deal with now? Let me go on to this idea of efficacy, okay? Clive came up and told us about the 5-hour meeting. He told us about how people are, in fact, waiting in the wings to prosecute these people for the atrocities committed in Zimbabwe. And how this is, in fact, very, very scary for the people in power. Okay, we have to show to you on our side of the house that our policy, in fact, incentivizes these people letting go of this power. And we think that this is going to happen, essentially because power is slipping at the moment, okay? These people can realize, the people in charge realize that eventually they are probably going to be ousted, okay? The reason they are hanging on is to try and get as much as they can at this point, okay? So what we're arguing on our side of the house is that essentially, if you take away the threat of prosecution, I'll actually take you in a second, so if you take away the threat of prosecution, actually no, I won't, we're going to incentivize them stepping down, because they're going to have to, they realize they're going to have to leave eventually anyway. They may as well do it now when they don't have the threat of prosecution hanging over their heads. Okay, so that deals nicely with effectiveness and clinches that for our side of the house. And I'd like to extend on this idea of justice that we were talking about. No, thank you. We've shown you the benefits that will accrue to the Zimbabwean population. We've shown you that, in fact, things are going to change through our policy. Let me show you why it's not detrimental in any way. I'll take you on this point, sir, in a second if you'd like to give me one on this one. But let's look at the purposes. Why do we usually prosecute people? We prosecute people to, firstly, okay, this idea of retribution. Secondly, to deter other people from committing similar crimes. Thirdly, to prevent these people from committing crimes again. And fourthly, the idea of reconciliation. Yes, sir.
How do we ensure that there's no backlash from the ground on these leaders once we give them total immunity?
Okay, so that falls in line with my point of prevention. Okay, you want to prosecute them because you think keeping them in society is a bad idea. Okay, this is where I'd like to give you some analysis of the sort of nature of the people we're dealing with here. The climate is very, very different from what it was when they first got into power. Essentially, these people do not pose a threat of harm to society anymore. Okay, and what we see is that essentially these people who are taking orders from the top. Okay, we're not dealing with a set of people who are still a threat to Zimbabwe, because essentially the feeling in Zimbabwe is very, very much against these people, okay? The feeling in Zimbabwe is not that actually they're really quite like ZANU, it's the people who have power who are driving this process. Secondly, this idea of retribution that we've already dealt with in our case. Okay, we think that retribution is not a valid purpose of punishment in this case because we think that the real victim of these crimes is wider Zimbabwean public, not the few isolated people who might feel bad if people don't go to jail. We think that the victims are basically wider Zimbabweans and they deserve to have their rights met. Okay, and what we need to look at is how we're best going to deal with their rights. And we say that our policy incentivizes the drastic change that needs to happen. Okay, and this is what's best going to lead to a sense of restoration in Zimbabwe and a sense of a peaceful restoration of the status quo. Third point I'd like to deal with is deterrence. Okay, do we need to deter people in Zimbabwe from repeating such crimes again? Ladies and gentlemen, no we don't. Just because the situation now is so different, the spread of opinion is very much against SADU and very much for NDC. Okay, and fourthly, this idea of reconciliation, which is where we believe that this is going. Okay, reconciliation is where our policy will take us. Reconciliation in the sense of people's rights being restored, people being in a sense of where they're going. We can only propose a solution.
House thanks Ingrid for that speech and calls upon the Deputy Leader of the Opposition, Mtshotshisa.
Right, now Clive and Ingrid have come here and tried to run a very convenient case, because at the end of the day what they should be arguing from the side is to actually show us how total immunity, ladies and gentlemen, without accountability will actually better the situation. Now Clive being Zimbabwe can run a very convenient case, but let me get to my rebuttal. Now ladies and gentlemen, we need to look at the following issue. Ingrid came and spoke about the issue of reconciliation. But what we say at the end of the day is within the South African context, ladies and gentlemen, that reconciliation will never work without any accountability from these individuals. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I'll come here and give to you an analysis, ladies and gentlemen, on the status quo, especially on dictators and what might happen, ladies and gentlemen. I'll give to you the trade-off between human rights, ladies and gentlemen, and total immunity for this dictator. And I'll show you the bad precedent that we're setting if we actually give total immunity, ladies and gentlemen, to these people. Now that is what we need to understand. Now this side of the house has actually ran away from that responsibility. Now ladies and gentlemen, they're coming up here, they're coming up here giving us a utopian example of, we say that if we actually give these people immunity, what's going to happen at the end of the day is that people from Zimbabwe are so tired of fighting, they're just going to leave, ladies and gentlemen. They're not going to want answers, they're not going to want anyone, ladies and gentlemen, to be prosecuted or to actually answer to these questions. And that is totally wrong, that is total hogwash at the end of the day, because at the end of the day, what we then say is, before you have, ladies and gentlemen, restorative justice, you need to have corrective justice. Now that is what we say. And ladies and gentlemen, once again, I will come to you and prove to you why we cannot, ladies and gentlemen, sit down. Why we cannot, ladies and gentlemen, say at the end of the day that we want to remove these people without total immunity. Now the first issue, ladies and gentlemen, sit down.
The first issue, ladies and gentlemen, we need to look at is the following. I'm going to give you an analysis. Now let's look at the status quo, especially when it comes to dictators. What we need to understand, and this is what the House, this side of the House does not understand, that the fact that dictators stay in power, ladies and gentlemen, through military power. So what then happens at the end of the day? Whoever tries to topple a dictator, ladies and gentlemen, that dictator has the military power to keep the power in his hands. Now this is the problem, ladies and gentlemen. We are fearing as opposition the backlash on the actual Zimbabwean people, ladies and gentlemen, if Bob's power was threatened. What we're then saying from opposition, sit down, Kevin. What we're then saying from opposition side is to actually incentivize, ladies and gentlemen, this guy to leave the country without any backlash. Because they rightly pointed out that this guy, ladies and gentlemen, is scared of the persecution from the Zimbabwean people, or is scared, ladies and gentlemen, from whatever country that they messed up with in the first place. Now that is what we say. We're then saying, sit down, sir. We're then saying we are avoiding, ladies and gentlemen, a situation where someone actually sit down. When someone actually holds on to power, ladies and gentlemen, regardless of whatever the status quo or whatever the case may be. And that is the biggest problem. So what opposition is actually coming here, and this is clarity, and this is what I want you to argue. What opposition is coming here up to is actually say then, ladies and gentlemen, how do we peacefully get this dictator out, but we do not give him total immunity, because that is the biggest problem. Before you have restorative justice, ladies and gentlemen, you need to have accountability, and that is what we say. Now, ladies and gentlemen, quickly, Kevin.
Okay, so beyond this corrective justice is the justice of freeing people from oppression immediately. And if immunity has the tendency to do that, we should give them immunity.
You see, that's the biggest problem, that you give these people immunity, and this is the key word within this debate that they all ran away from. Total immunity, ladies and gentlemen, which is the biggest problem. Total immunity means that at the end of the day, you just wake up one day or leave the office, say, you know what, I'm no longer president anymore, but I'm going to be immune, and I'm just going to live like it ever is. There are questions, sit down, Clive. There are questions to be answered, ladies and gentlemen, and these are the people that we believe should be accountable and should be answering these questions, because at the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen, it's the only way we can move forward. The nice thing is that Ingrid, ladies and gentlemen, in South Africa, she saw in South Africa what happened is the fact that when people started accounting, ladies and gentlemen, for the horrors within apartheid, what then happened is South Africans actually are moving slowly but surely, ladies and gentlemen, away, ladies and gentlemen, for the scars from the past. And now that is the biggest issue we need to look at here. We're saying that at the end of the day, people need to come account and sit down and say, I did this, that, and that, and that, ladies and gentlemen. For actually those people who have closure. But we are, what we are scared of is to actually have a violent backlash down. What we're actually scared of is to have a violent backlash from these dictators if we're actually going to say, but no, look, we're going to give you total immunity. And what is and this is sit down, Clive. The biggest question we also need to ask here is that, ladies and gentlemen, how do we know that if we say that we're going to give you immunity, that these people are not going to stay in power anyway because they are totally immune, and then they're not going to account to anyone? And that is the biggest question, and that is their failure, that they've answered, the point that they've failed to answer within this debate. Now, ladies and gentlemen, after that analysis, I'm going to give you the trade-off. What we need to understand, ladies and gentlemen, that within a dictatorial state, ladies and gentlemen, there is a gross human rights violation, ladies and gentlemen. There's big issues that happen within those countries for those people to stay into power. What is proposition then saying at the end of the day? Are they saying that, look, you know what, get out because human rights violations, there were human rights violations, but look, we're going to let you go? And this is the issue that they should be arguing, and this is the issue that you should be actually justifying to us and the House, as to whether they say that give these people total immunity, let them leave without accounting for anyone, which is actually wrong, ladies and gentlemen. So then, what is the trade-off? What are they giving a trade-off, ladies and gentlemen, to human rights violations? Are they giving a trade-off to human rights violations and, ladies and gentlemen, the immunity of this person? And that is what we're saying. We're saying that to ensure a peaceful exit, ladies and gentlemen, incentivize these gentlemen to actually leave the country. That is the first and the biggest issue, ladies and gentlemen. So that restorative justice can actually take place after, ladies and gentlemen, corrective justice has placed, after that person has actually sat down and accounted for these issues. Now, they have failed to answer from that issue, ladies and gentlemen. Now, my next point, ladies and gentlemen, will be the point will be the point of actually setting a bad precedent. Now, what they are saying then to the House is that whoever, ladies and gentlemen, violates human rights grossly, ladies and gentlemen, is scot-free to go, because at the end of the day, we want overnight change, and overnight change is impossible. I think they know that by now. So what we're then saying is that no one goes anywhere, ladies and gentlemen, until they have accounted for these people. But we are also avoiding a situation where these people are going to stay in power, are going to keep that power violently so, ladies and gentlemen. So this is what we say, that give these people people incentive to leave, ladies and gentlemen, but after having accounted to the people who these crimes were committed against. Because that is the biggest issue that we need to look at. These are the people that were actually affected, and these are the people that need to hear those answers, that need to hear those confessions to actually get closure. And this is the biggest problem that they failed to address. I hope Ruth or Kevin comes and does that for us, ladies and gentlemen, because we need to speak, and this is what our proposition needs to speak to, the issue of total accountability, or total immunity, ladies and gentlemen. Total immunity, and that is what they have failed. I've given you, ladies and gentlemen, I'll show you an analysis, ladies and gentlemen, of dictatorial governments and how they hold on to power. And the biggest issue here is what opposition is fearing is a violent backlash, ladies and gentlemen. What opposition is fearing that, and this is what opposition is advocating for, a peaceful removal. And for that,
for his speech and calls upon the Member of Government, Umar.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I actually know the two gentlemen that just came up here and given a speech. I think they're brave guys. But what I think they've done today is taken a very coward type of argument. This whole idea that we will have conditional immunity. What exactly are they talking about? And what precedent, if they're so worried about precedent, is conditional immunity? How is it practical? How does it work? Do you get charged for the murders in that region and not charged for the murders in that region? Their entire policy is so flimsy, and we fundamentally think it's a coward position to assume. They needed to come up here and be a little bit more brave about the positions that they are here to assume. And besides that, that's the first issue that we want to clash with them on, that this idea of conditional immunity is impractical, it is ununderstandable, and we don't know where it's going, and it in itself actually sets a bad precedent anyway, Mr. Speaker. Now, here's a couple of things that I want to do. I want to start off with rebuttals, Mr. Speaker, and then I'll move on to our extension and our substantive matter. The first thing that they brought up on this side of the House is this idea of corrective justice and the different justices that have been thrown around. Let me tell you what is the justice that we're looking for here, Mr. Speaker. What we are looking for here is the justice of freeing people from oppression immediately. Beyond this corrective justice and this other legal terminology that they're using, we are dealing with an actual situation where people are dying on a daily, where cholera is ravaging the country. So all these ideas and principles about law, which are fantastic, and under ordinary circumstances, we would apply them. These are very extraordinary circumstances, Mr. Speaker, and we are saying that what is most important here now is the justice of freeing people from oppression immediately. That's the first thing. The second thing, this idea of accountability, or the lack of accountability, Mr. Speaker, that, for example, the next regime will also be unaccountable. That, for starters, is a heavy assertion, Mr. Speaker. It is based on this idea that one bad guy will come out and the next bad guy will come in. We only have to point, no thank you, you only have to point to South Africa, go away. You only have to point to South Africa, Mr. Speaker, to show how one regime left and was given immunity, and the new regime today is an accountable regime. We don't even only have to look at South Africa. You can look at Ghana and Jerry Rawlings. You can look at General Pinochet in Chile. All sorts of circumstances where people have been given immunity or partial immunity, and the government subsequently have been more than accountable. So that idea is fully flat. No, thank you, go away. And the idea that incentives, the word incentive was thrown around at the end of the speech, which is fantastic, which is fantastic, Mr. Speaker. The incentive that we are trying to give by immunity clearly is a far greater incentive than this idea of, well, you might or you might not, or you'll partially be tried or you partially won't be tried. Actually, what they are saying doesn't actually give a full-out incentive. It still leaves a lot of fear in those leaders that I might actually still be punished for what I've done. So they are not offering incentive. What we are doing on this side of the House is offering actual and real incentive, Mr. Speaker. So those are the three arguments. This corrective justice thing, it's nice, but it doesn't apply with the pressing need. Their whole argument is very flippy-floppy because It's a coward argument. They have to go one way or the other. And this whole accountability or lack thereof, it's a heavy assertion that the next guys will also be bad. Now, about my substantive matter, Mr. Speaker, what am I here to do? I want to show you that if you give Robert Mugabe immunity, it will sort out the political situation, or rather give energy to political change in Zimbabwe, Mr. Speaker. And that is what I'm here to do. First thing I want to talk to you guys about is the nature of dictators and the objective of why we're doing this. And I think this was missed out in the first half of the debate. The objective, what is it that we're trying to do in the actual sense? And then my core arguments will be about the cost-benefit analysis of what we're trying to do. And I'll talk a little bit about the negotiation process itself and the whole art of bargaining and why we need to bargain with these kind of guys. First of all, Mr. Speaker, we think clearly, and this was stated on the first half, that the nature of dictatorial systems is that they're very personal. So we think that when you get rid of the leader, the regime will naturally crumble as well. So first of all, the fact that we're attacking the leader, we just want to make it clear that we think it'll have a far-reaching effect and it'll sort out the problem in its entirety. About the actual objective, and this is where really our extension starts to kick in, Mr. Speaker. The objective must not be lost here. What we're trying to do, Mr. Speaker, is to remove him from power. We argue on this side of the house, go away, that the desire to punish Robert Mugabe is a lot less than the desire to get rid of him immediately. Now, that is the objective that we're raising, Mr. Speaker, that we're trying to get rid of the person. We love justice. We love when the courts and law operates functionally and well and all of these things. But right now, beyond all of those rational and really nice ideas, is to get rid of someone who is dictating, who is oppressing the people, who is persecuting and killing people, Mr. Speaker. So we have to keep in mind what the true objective is. And our policy, we contend, is aimed at this actual objective. It is aimed at getting rid of him, not tomorrow, not later, but immediately go.
How can you ensure that if this guy is already immune, totally immune, as you're saying, that he's not going to hold on to power anyway? That's what you failed to show us.
No, Mr. Speaker, the motion says immunity for resignation. So obviously when you give him immunity, he will resign and he won't be there. I don't know what you're talking about. Mr. Speaker, now let's move from this objective. And we clearly said to you that what we are proposing on this House will actually meet the objective of this entire debate, the objective of this entire policy to get rid of him, Mr. Speaker. The second matter, which is also part of our extension, is the cost-benefit analysis. What is the actual cost, Mr. Speaker? We see that the cost is, the actual cost right now is continued oppression, continued dictatorship, and all these bad things that we see happening in Zimbabwe at the current moment, Mr. Speaker. And the benefit of removing him, and the benefit of removing him, Mr. Speaker, we say is to effect a regime change, to bring back some sort of normality in governance, some sort of democracy which is functional, where courts are working. So here's the cost. One, you keep him in power, and you have this continued oppression, you have these continued lapses of governance in Zimbabwe. And the benefit of what we're saying, very clearly, and this is fundamental, it's black and white. The benefit of what we are saying, will effect the regime change, will bring hopefully some sort of popular and legitimate government into power. Go.
Okay, we'd like to confirm that what you say is not going to fix Zimbabwe's problem tomorrow. However, what we're saying is that if you give him an opportunity to lead properly, you set up a proper governance system which we can be able to...
And I think, Mr. Speaker, my second speaker is also going to talk about this, about the issue of peace and stability, and the fact that if you give this sort of immunity, you're more likely to get peace and immunity, Mr. Speaker. So that will be shown on the second half of the speech. Now, my third matter, after I've just described to you what the cost of keeping him in there is, and what the benefit of letting him out is, Mr. Speaker, I want to move on to the negotiation process, Mr. Speaker. The very art of negotiating. Let's sort of get out of politics for a while and talk about negotiation and that process itself. Mr. Speaker, you have to give and take. You are not going to negotiate with the ZANU-PF government and the bad guys and say, well, after we kick you out, we're going to send you to prison, take all of your money, but please get out. It's not going to work, Mr. Speaker. You have to offer them some sort of legitimate incentive, Mr. Speaker. And in that negotiation process, we think that the opposition and all the other good guys must be willing to make some of these concessions. And if the concession is only to say, we won't punish you, but please leave us alone, we think that that will be a good thing, Mr. Speaker. So we think that even in the art of negotiating, the government or the opposition have to actually be able and willing to offer something to the likes of Mugabe. If they offer nothing and say, well, we're going to punish you, or we're going to partly prosecute you and partly not, we don't think that this is going to work, Mr. Speaker. What we are saying on this side of the House is that the desire to punish Robert Mugabe is fundamentally a lot less than the desire to get rid of him now. These issues of justice, Mr. Speaker, they make us sound like what they don't.
member of government and calls upon the member of opposition, John.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is John Ofiku, and I'm the member of the opposition. Very interesting debate this far, I must comment. I must say it has been messy, very, very messy. From the opening side of government, we've basically heard the need for restorative justice, and we've also heard how army generals are actually the ones who are pressuring Mugabe to stay in power. That's what we've heard from the opening side. And we've also heard from the opening opposition that basically what needs to be done is, of course, restoring the position of the people by giving them that conscious freedom that the perpetrator has been punished. But their policy also, unfortunately, the opposition side, was kind of running around because it sort of shoot themselves in the foot as well. And definitely not worse than the case brought about in the first half. So I must stress that the first half has been a very, very messy debate. However, we feel that we are not subject to what has gone on, that it is time to bring justice to this debate. You see, what has been raised by closing government this far is this issue of need. Not inconsent. Is this issue of need, you know, an imminent need, therefore an imminent solution, and this immunity is the best solution. However, in our extension, we'd actually come up and say why there is actually a better solution than the one that they're advocating for, and in the case of Zimbabwe, why it would be detrimental, not only to Zimbabwe itself, but in the context of Africa. Now, let me start with the rebuttal. He said there is a need to free people immediately. You see, what he misunderstood is that this motion, not taking it, this motion will actually give you that option, you know, will give you that option of immunity in exchange for resignation. It does not say, it does not guarantee that this dictator will take it. Therefore, they have to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that the leader in power is actually dying to step down, but the only thing that's keeping him in power is the fact that he is subject to persecution. That is what they needed to state. Now this brings me into the issue really here. Do dictators actually stay in power because they are in fear of persecution? Let's take Mugabe for example. You see, the reason Mugabe is in power is because of money. Money equals power, and power equals money. Unless you can actually secure and guarantee him that money and the luxuries that he has currently, he will definitely still stay in power. A classical example is a man who has been hungry his whole life. He stumbles upon a bank and he robs the bank, and all of a sudden he is a rich man. Now tell me, will a man who's been hungry his whole life give up his wealth just so that he can be a free, hungry man? Will he do that? That, ladies and gentlemen, is the reality of African leaders, and that is why they stay in power, not because of fear of humility. This flimsy argument that came from the opening gov saying that army generals are responsible for keeping Mugabe in power. Mugabe is actually this good soul who wants to step down. You see, Mugabe, if this were true, let's take Mugabe. He's actually friends with Sam Nujoma from Namibia. He was friends with Thabo Mbeki and various other African leaders. The ones who so far openly actually go against him has been Botswana. The rest of the African leaders are smiling with Mugabe. If these generals were the only impediment in his way for him to step down, certainly Mugabe can get international military intervention from other countries. He is the president of his country. He can talk to Nujoma, he can talk to Thabo Mbeki and various other leaders. So to say that the generals are the ones pressuring him to stay in power and that he's ready to step down is a fallacy. Allow me to
You misunderstood our argument. We're not saying immunity will necessarily make them quit, but it's one of the things that might encourage them to quit along with other things.
You see, that's now a classical shot on his own behalf, because he said there is an imminent need and there's an imminent solution, meaning that what they are proposing is the solution. And now he's saying that no, there actually are the various solutions, and this is actually one of them. Yeah. You see, what we are actually saying, you see, this brings me into our extension, which was kind of highlighted by opening opposition, but he actually failed to go into the nitty-gritties of it. Most dictators stay in power due to military intervention. This far, I have proved the harm that would actually come about if we allow this immunity to take place in exchange for resignation. It will send a message that any president can go into power, mess up, violate human rights, enrich himself, and at the end of the day say, I will resign and keep his word. That's basically what the policy proposed. Now what we are saying is, yes, there is an imminent need. However, ladies and gentlemen, time and time in history has shown that not all imminent needs can be solved immediately. A great example is climate change. A great example is alternative forms of energy. The only way we can solve these things is actually by coming up with long-term policies that solve this need. Just because there is an imminent need doesn't always mean that there is an imminent solution. I have shown how this solution falls flat. Allow me to give you a long-term solution. The only long-term solution that there is to solve this problem of dictatorship and zero tolerance, ladies and gentlemen, for human rights violations and self-enrichment is international military intervention by African states to actually promote justice in their countries and in their continent. And this justice, ladies and gentlemen, is according to the three theories of justice, which have thus far, ladies and gentlemen, been misquoted. They are not reconciliation. No, they are retribution, meaning you pay for your crimes, rehabilitation to try and change you, and last but not least, deterrence to keep you from committing this crime again. Opening up, you are already dead, please sit down. This debate falls on the issue of what is the best solution. So far, I've adequately shown the harm, and that Mugabe, they have failed to show that Mugabe is actually waiting to step down, and the only thing that's stopping him is actually immunity. They have failed to adequately show that, and I've shown that power and money is actually what these guys are hungry for. They live in poor countries. If they step down, they know there's that possibility that they're going to be poor, that they're going to be suffering. That's the reason they are dictators. They violate human rights to get money. They violate human rights to stay in power, to get money. It's all about the Benjamins. You see, what we have shown this far is that international military intervention is the best solution. And the reason this is the best solution and how we're going to do it is during elections. We're going to wait for the next election in Zimbabwe, allow for military intervention to take place among African states, to send military force there to actually make sure that no results are rigged. That way, Mugabe stepped down democratically because he's voted against, and not because someone shipped him on somewhere and gave him an excuse for actually enriching himself and violating human rights. So that's basically what we should move to. A form of African unity that takes a strong stand against oppression of any kind. And it is by virtue of these decrees, their lack of evidence and our convictions that I beg to oppose. I think.
Speech and calls upon the government group.
Okay, so good evening everyone. As the name suggests, government whip. Let's whip this debate into real shape. What we heard was just now John going on an emotional rant. But what I'm going to do here is take us to the facts, take us to the things that will work and the way we need to do these things properly. So the first thing I'm going to do is analyze what it is that happened in the entire debate and then give particular focus and attention to our extension and tell you why exactly it is that we should win this debate. So first of all, starting with opening opposition, what we heard was this idea of corrective justice, this idea of accountability, and then again they talked about giving incentive, and then again they talked about exiling Mugabe out somewhere. Now, what we need
to realize is that they don't understand that dictators are not really reasonable guys. Dictators are not really people who want to be accountable for their actions. We cannot incentivize them and then attach accountability as a condition to that incentivification. And then this idea of corrective justice, we've established that what they actually fear is prosecution. And it is not in fact corrective justice to offer them half and half, no thank you, to offer them half and half immunity. And in fact on that particular point of where they took this sort of middle ground argument where they talked about half and half immunity, not total immunity, what we need to understand is opening government clearly set the parameters for this debate. And what they said is that these dictators will include Robert Mugabe and his cohorts. And Robert Mugabe and his cohorts have committed various humanitarian crimes on different levels. And so what exactly is going to be sort of the bar, the measuring bar for this immunity? Are we going to say if person X did this, person Y did this, and then you get immunity? And in fact, we believe that's going to be counterproductive. It's actually going to make these dictators want to hold on to power because they wouldn't be sure of whether or not they're guaranteed immunity. They would feel they'll be being held partially accountable for particular things, and therefore that falls completely flat. And then they talked about exiling the particular dictator. In this case, we have Robert Mugabe and his cohorts to another country. But what we need to recognize is the international record, no thank you Moses, is the international record that has been set by Robert Mugabe himself. Now Robert Mugabe is not a person who's made friends with many countries in the world. And so we believe that not many countries will be willing to receive him as we ship him off and let him go scot-free. And he himself, as their closing government, alluded to the fact that these dictators are actually incentivized by money. If we ship him off, move him out of his comfort zone into a place where there is no guarantee he'll have money, this will in fact de-incentivize him, and therefore it becomes completely counterproductive. No, Moses. Now, this whole idea of a trade-off, human rights violation. Now, what Kevin and I are focusing on is that we've established a problem. And what we're doing is tackling the problem. We don't want to live in the past. We're not at all undermining the things that have happened in the past, but what we're saying is let's deal with the problem at hand. No, let's deal with the problem that's here now. Of course, there are measures in place already to deal with the psychological effects that people have from experiencing these things. But what we're saying is we want to stop the problem now, and the most effective way to do this is through offering complete immunity to these particular dictators. And then again, we heard from opening government, which we completely agree with, this whole idea of effectiveness and the principle of justice. And we believe that indeed they were on the right track. But as you will clearly see in my extension, we sort of fleshed out the arguments and gave you the more important opinion of this debate. Now moving on to John, who just left the podium now. He talked about offering a better solution and then went and talked about international military intervention, forgetting that dictators don't respond particularly well to people meddling in their affairs, to this particular issue of international military intervention. And because of that, yes, Moses.
I think you don't buy this whole idea of your total immunity.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Sir, Mugabe is going to be totally unreasonable that he will not be willing to take this idea of a middle ground. And don't forget, it's not just Mugabe, so it's his cohorts. So we're advocating for a standard immunity, where everyone knows exactly where they stand and knows exactly what they stand to gain. No. Now, moving on to this issue, I was talking about this idea of international military intervention. And they also mentioned this idea of rehabilitating dictators. Now, dictators are not the sweetest guys around. They're not actually willing to be rehabilitated. What they want is to get their way and to benefit themselves. And we believe that this can only be done through total immunity. No. And then again, they talked about having a better solution, but we showed you that this is in fact a detrimental solution. This whole idea of international military intervention, again, becomes very counterproductive because we don't know which African countries will be willing to step into the territory of Robert Mugabe. Rather, we're going to offer him and his cohorts immunity so that they can peacefully leave. And remember here, the idea is offering it in exchange for resignation. So the acceptance of that immunity will indeed guarantee that resignation. No. So now moving on to what it is that Kevin and I brought to this debate. So first of all, I'm going to go into my positive matter. As he mentioned, I'm going to talk about this whole idea of peace and stability, which is actually strengthened by this ridiculous idea of international military intervention by the African unity. Now, we believe that, yes, indeed, they do have control. These dictators do have military control. So what is going to happen if we don't use total immunity to incentivize them? Without total immunity, the only option is to use force. And using this force will in fact lead these particular dictators to also invoke their own military cohorts. And this will actually trickle down to disadvantaging the people on the ground. And so therefore it becomes a disadvantageous and dysfunctional policy. And in fact, we're looking at the bigger picture. It is much more desirable to offer someone presidential immunity, to have him to offer him, this immunity that has him removed from this particular regime and benefit the people immediately in that they will be freed from his rule, as opposed to having him sit in front of a whole group of people, which he is actually unlikely to do, and say that he's very sorry for all the things that he's done. That will not be effective, and it will not, in fact, advance their case. So totally we've seen that they've been completely unreasonable. Now the next issue I'm going to tackle quickly is that issue of the overview of granting immunity. Immunity will actually be the most efficient way to do this, and it will be quicker. Why? Because it appeals to the dictators and his cohorts. It's been thrown back and forth, the idea of what happened in this meeting. But it's safe to say that everybody in that meeting didn't want to get into trouble after the meeting, didn't want to be punished for stepping down. So if we remove this particular fear and incentivize them with this total immunity, it will in fact guarantee a sort of peaceful transition from one government into the other. So generally, there are about 4 issues that come up from our side here. We've given you the objective of removing these particular leaders. We've talked about the nature of dictators. We've also talked about this cost-benefit analysis and how implementing our ideas will actually guarantee peace and stability, as opposed to this idea of military intervention and this idea of taking the half and half ground. So we believe this is actually the most effective way to go. And again, we're going to reiterate that the desire to punish Robert Mugabe and his cohorts, or the willingness of Robert Mugabe and his cohorts to actually accept this military intervention, is much less than the desire and the need for these people to be freed from the oppressive regime.
Thanks, Ruth, for that speech. It calls upon the final speaker in this debate, the Chief Whip, Albert.
Hey everyone, Albert Titus, Position Work. Ladies and gentlemen, the burden of proof that the government had was threefold. A, that this is the best option to get a dictator. And C, that there is absolutely a guarantee that this dictator will have no influence on politics in his country, even him being out of power. As we've seen with many New Yorker case in point, that even ousted presidents still have an effect on politics within their country. So this is what we're seeing, ladies and gentlemen. They failed to prove all 3 things. But before I go into our extension, which we feel addresses the key issues in the debate, let's start a bit with the cases that we've seen from the 2 sides here of government. Firstly, the assumption that came up from opening government, as I said, is that generals back Mugabe for their fear of persecution. We contend that no, that is not the case. They back up dictators, A, for the safety of their jobs, because they are very unpopular guys within their country, and the president is the guy that's keeping them employed, and for the financial luxury that comes with this. That comes with us. And the reason why I'm saying that, ladies and gentlemen, and this is why this is a main flaw in their argument, the reason why I'm saying that is that generals don't have immunity against persecution. Presidents have immunity against persecution. This comes by virtue of the fact that presidents are the commander-in-chief of their army, and therefore you see this sort of a vicarious liability issue of where presidents are accountable for the issues of their military. Therefore, generals don't inherently stay in power because of that fear for persecution. So that was the first flaw in their argument. The other flaw in their policy, ladies and gentlemen, is this issue of deterrence. This came up from England. And this is grossly inapplicable, ladies and gentlemen, by virtue of the fact that a promise of immunity after human rights violations does not deter anyone from happily continuing with such violations, ladies and gentlemen. So how does deterrence play a part in their promise of immunity, ladies and gentlemen? So not taken out, Kevin. Let's go on now, ladies and gentlemen, to closing government.
And the first thing that we heard from them, ladies and gentlemen, is that we need, I don't really get what their extension was, but what they basically talked about, ladies and gentlemen, is that we need to remove Mugabe immediately. That's what we need to do. However, as we've highlighted, this does not guarantee that he will step down, ladies and gentlemen. Now, Kevin himself used the term negotiations, ladies and gentlemen. And the term negotiations means that there is the all likelihood that a negotiation will fail, ladies and gentlemen. This shows that by the very nature of the practice of negotiations, a resignation, a desired deal is not always guaranteed, ladies and gentlemen. And therefore, that whole policy is entirely flawed. Let's go on to Ruth's little argument, ladies and gentlemen, about force. And what I want to say in this argument, ladies and gentlemen, is that we need to ask ourselves the question, when is force just? Because she's attacking our policy of military intervention. And we say that force is just when it is done to advance the interests of society. And currently, the interests of society are to protect the people from Mugabe's dictatorship, ladies and gentlemen.
So just for interest, are you sharpening opening government counter policy, or are you trying to grab both?
What we are doing is coming to the issue of this debate. The issue of this debate is what is the best way to get Mugabe out of power, ladies and gentlemen. And we've provided a tangible and a credible means to do so. So, what we've heard from closing opposition is A, that perpetrators need to account for their violations. And we wholeheartedly agree with them. And then we've also heard, ladies and gentlemen, that they want to ensure a peaceful removal, ladies and gentlemen. But we felt in our extension that A, we need to address why are dictators able to stay in power. And we agree with everyone here that because they have the backing of the military. But what we are saying, ladies and gentlemen, is that the military is therefore able to rig elections and impose fear during elections, ladies and gentlemen. Therefore, if we can subdue the military power within Zimbabwe via international military intervention, ladies and gentlemen, this means that the backbone of the dictator is therefore crippled, isn't it? This means that elections within a country can peacefully, without fear, proceed. And if MDC is as strong as they contain, Mugabe can then be removed from power, ladies and gentlemen. We've seen with Saddam Hussein in Iraq, ladies and gentlemen, that what happened was that the United States were actually able to get to the generals and the commanders in Saddam's hierarchy, ladies and gentlemen, and therefore Saddam had to start fleeing the country, ladies and gentlemen. We have to look in this instance, ladies and gentlemen, at the interests of the state. This is very important. You have the right to see a person that infringes upon your rights brought to book, ladies and gentlemen. Their policy does not give that service, that right to the citizens of Zimbabwe, ladies and gentlemen, because what they are saying to the citizens of Zimbabwe is that we are sorry that your rights were infringed, but we're not going to do anything to this guy, ladies and gentlemen. We don't even know if this plan that we have will work, ladies and gentlemen. What we've showed you from this side of the house, ladies and gentlemen, is that we have a more tangible, more credible way, ladies and gentlemen, to actually ensure that Mugabe gets out of power. So our policy, therefore, A, protects the human interests within Zimbabwe that government is looking for, but at the same time, it is a more accurate means to remove him from power, because we are actually zoning in on the people that keep him in power. Now, what I've showed you, ladies and gentlemen, is that A, as I said, this is a much more credible means, but B, as I said, that they have failed to prove that this is the best way to get a guy out of power, ladies and gentlemen. Slobodan Milosevic, Saddam Hussein, dictators over the world have been persecuted for their crimes. They have not been given negotiation deals, ladies and gentlemen, and we feel that therefore, because of that precedence, because of that history, it is not necessary to go to this length to get Mugabe out of power, ladies and gentlemen. It's by virtue of all these things that I beg to oppose this motion, and that I feel that we've clearly won this game hands down.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's go. Loud round of applause for all the teams in the final. I invite the speakers to cross the floor and shake hands, and everyone else to go outside and have the lovely dinner.